Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our regular halacha shir. This class, is dedicated to the memory of Baruch Tzvi ben Yosef Meir, Zichrono Livracha. Rav Baruch Tzvi passed away before the Web Yeshiva really got started. However, he had been both a Talmud and a teacher in the former Gilgul, in the former incarnation of this yeshiva, which Rabbi Bravender had operated before the Web Yeshiva actually got started. He was not only an outstanding lamdan, someone whose life was fully engaged with Torah and mitzvos, not only was he an outstanding teacher, but he was also a human being of great cheer. I remember when he was suffering with the worst of his medical condition in hospital, suffering greatly, as he used to like to say himself. On a scale of 1 to 10, he was suffering at the level of Treblinka. Even in the midst of his greatest suffering, he was able to maintain an even keel, good balance, good cheer, fully and totally devoted and dedicated to Avodas Hashem and Torah and mitzvahs. I, in my engagement with him, recognized these two characteristics, his learning and his good cheer. Of course, people are very complicated, and I'm sure others have a lot more to say about him than that. This said, let us turn to the subject of our shiur tonight, which has to do with the deceased. The question arises: to what extent and under what circumstances is it correct or permissible to engage in dialogue or perhaps monologue with the deceased? Let's start looking at the sources. They will speak for themselves, and we will understand what the great poskim have to say about dialogue or monologue with those who have passed away. The whole discussion begins with a verse in the Torah. What it says in the Torah is, Lo yimatzeh b'cha, there should not be found among the Jewish people, Doresh el hametim. There should not be found among the Jewish people anyone who seeks out the dead. Doresh et hametim. Anyone seeking out the dead is in violation of this prohibition of the Torah, in violation of this pasuk. So, of course, this is what we are going to want to define very carefully. Exactly what is it that is prohibited under the rubric of this verse? Well, what is permitted and what is prohibited? Is one allowed to visit the grave site of the deceased? Is visiting the grave site a violation of seeking them out? Speaking to them either by mouth or mentally in the mind, is that a violation? Well, and so forth and so on. Let's start looking at the sources, and then we'll get a clear idea of what's going on here. First of all, Hadoresh el hametim, someone who violates this prohibition of the Torah and seeks out the dead, chayav makot, gets the Torah penalty of makot. Makot, whipping, is the standard Torah prohibition for violation of ordinary negative commandments. It is not so severe that it calls for the death penalty. This is a regular level prohibition of the Torah, calling in its violation for makas. And you have the sources for all of these ideas on the screen. So we understand that the level of significance, the level of importance of the prohibition is that of a ordinary prohibition of the Torah, rather like the prohibition of eating milk and meats together, or the prohibition of eating chazir, rather like that ordinary level of Torah prohibition, well, which is pretty severe. pretty severe. We're talking about something which is clearly very important. Now, what is the underlying definition of the seeker of the deceased? Well, the Gemara has the following words, and the words of the Gemara are then quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. So, although not every passage in the Gemara is halachically definitive and normative, this one is, because these words of the Gemara are quoted in the Shulchan Aruch. Ezehu doresh el hametim. Who is it that is guilty of seeking out the dead and therefore guilty of a Torah violation? Ze hamar'iv et atzmo, someone who starves himself, goes on a fast. Now forgive me for always speaking in the masculine. She starves herself. She goes on a fast. He starves himself. He goes on a fast. It's all the same whether it's a man or a woman. The holech, after having fasted, he or she goes vilan and spends the night beveit hakvarot, in the cemetery. You go through a ritual preparation of fasting, then you go to the cemetery and you spend the night in the cemetery. Kidei shetishra alav ruach tum'ah. In order, the reason you're doing all this is so that the ruach tum'ah, the impure spirit, will fall upon you. Someone who has a ritual preparation goes to the cemetery, spends the night in the cemetery so that the impure spirit of the cemetery will descend upon him. That's the person who is guilty. Now, I don't know many people. I'm a very simple person. I know people in the Beis Midrash, but the people in the Beis Midrash I know don't do this, and I'm quite sure that there are not many people out there in the world who are doing it. Maybe a few here and there, but let's see whether or not these words are to be taken literally. Is it literally only these people who are guilty? Or is this only one example, and perhaps there are more practical examples which are similar to this, which are also prohibited? Let's look at the commentaries of the Rishonim, the great medieval authorities. Let's see how the Rishonim understood this, and then we'll be able to answer the question, are we to take this sentence literally? Only people who starve themselves spend the night in the cemetery so that the evil spirit will descend upon them, those are the only guys who are guilty? Or is this only an example, and we're going to have to expand the category of prohibited activities according to some rule? Let's see what the Rishonim say. First is Rashi. There is, of course, no greater commentary on the Gemara, on the Talmud than Rashi. Without Rashi's commentary, the Talmud would be more or less a closed book to us. Rashi says, what is this evil spirit descending upon the person? It's a shed. Shed is an evil spirit. Shel beit hakvarot. And there is in the cemetery an evil spirit. Yehei ohavo. And if you go through the proper rituals, the evil spirit, this shed, this evil spirit who resides in the cemetery will like you because you are doing service to this evil spirit, going through the correct rituals which this evil spirit wants you to do. Umisayo, and then the evil spirit will help you. Bikshafav, when you come to perform magic. Okay, this is what Rashi understands. Rashi understands the whole problem here is that the cemetery is occupied not only by the deceased who are buried there, but also by some shed, some evil spirit. And what the Torah is prohibiting is for anyone to placate that evil spirit. The Torah is prohibiting anyone from going through the rituals to bring pleasure to that evil spirit for the purpose of having that evil spirit descend upon you so that when you come to perform magic, you'll be able to do magic with the help of that spirit. He's not talking about a stage magician performing sleight of hand. He's talking about real magic, which he believed really existed, and that too is a controversial issue. But that's what Rashi has to say. Now, if you think about it for a moment, you'll realize that Rashi has led us into a very unusual understanding of the original verse. The original verse in the Torah commanded us not to be among the seekers of the dead. According to Rashi, the deceased who are buried in the cemetery have nothing to do with this prohibition at all. The problem is not seeking out the dead, which is the simple meaning of the words in the verse of the Torah. Rather, according to Rashi, the prohibition is going to the place where the dead reside, going to the cemetery, not because the dead are there, but because this evil spirit happens to also live in the cemetery. According to Rashi, the prohibition of the Torah, Doresh el hametim, is not seeking out the deceased, but rather the prohibition is to seek out the place, the location of the deceased, namely the cemetery, because that is where the evil spirit is, and we are not allowed to deal with these evil spirits. We are not allowed to placate them, to please them. We are not allowed to accept their help in performing magic. Now, according to Rashi, there's not much room to prohibit communication with the dead themselves. Asking questions of the dead, whether it's a dialogue hoping to get back answers, or a monologue just speaking to the dead. According to Rashi, that's not problematic at all. That's not what the verse had in mind. What the verse prohibits us is dealing with this evil spirit who happens to live in the cemetery. Now, I know that over the last 150 years, over the last 200 years or so, I know that belief in Shadim, belief in the existence of these evil spirits, has declined greatly in the Western world. I find it a mystery. I am puzzled by why the belief in the existence of evil spirits has declined in the Western world. After all, anyone who's used a computer knows that computers are often occupied by evil spirits. The evil spirits often reside in them. There's surely no other way to explain the frequent misbehaving of computers. They obviously must be inhabited by Shadim. Anyone could see that. But despite the evidence before our eyes, many people out there claim to reject the existence of these things. Now let me point out that this rationalist approach, according to which there is no such thing as a shade, an evil spirit, a very popular view nowadays, this idea existed among the Rishonim, not Rashi. Here we see Rashi embraces the existence of these shadim, but the idea that they did not exist was an idea among some Rishonim. The Rambam was the greatest of the Rishonim to reject the possibility that these shadim exist. He was a rationalist. The reason denies the existence of these shadim, and therefore the Rambam held they simply don't exist. This left the Rambam with a problem, because after all, these shadim are mentioned in quite a number of passages in the Gemara, and how could the Rambam deny that something which the Gemara discusses? How could the Rambam deny that something which the Gemara discusses exists? And this forced the Rambam to reinterpret all of those passages in the Gemara which mention shadim. I'll just give you one example, and you'll understand his approach. It says in the Gemara that in order to convict a murderer of capital crime, in order to execute a convicted murderer, in order for the rabbinic court to convict him and sentence him to death, one of the many requirements is hatra'ah. The defendant, the murderer, must have been warned immediately prior to committing the murder, must have been warned that what he or she is about to do is an act of murder prohibited by the Torah and carries the death penalty. If the accused murderer or murderess did not receive that warning immediately before committing the crime, then we don't have any good proof that the crime was done wantonly on purpose. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe it was an accident, maybe he didn't intend to do it, who knows what. We need to have how close is immediately? Around somewhere between 4 and 8 seconds. The post can disagree, but really immediately before. And the Gemara says it's not the witnesses to the murder who have to warn him. The witnesses to the murder can warn him, but even if a shed, an evil spirit, warns him, and the witnesses hear that he was warned, that's enough to convict him. Well, you see, the Gemara talks about the evil spirits. How can the Rambam deny their existence? The great rabbis of the Gemara mention them in this practical, maybe not very practical, but important halacha. What the Rambam says in the Mishnah Torah is that, of course, the defendant has to be warned prior to committing the crime, but the warning might come from a disembodied voice. The witnesses don't have to see the person who is giving the warning. Now, all the witnesses have to do is hear that the warning was given. If they hear the warning was given, that's enough for the witnesses to testify that there was a warning, and the murderer can be convicted. So the Rambam has transformed the shed, the evil spirit of the Gemara, into a disembodied voice, a human voice, where the witnesses simply don't know where the voice came from. They could not see who was uttering the warning, but they know there was a warning that they heard. Okay, the Rambam was not the only one of the great Rishonim to deny the existence of Shadim. There were a few others, not many. Most great medieval authorities believed in Shadim, but among the few others rejecting the existence was Ibn Ezra, the great poet of medieval Spain, the commentary on the Torah, which is so important. Ibn Ezra is one of the big names in the rabbinic world in the Middle Ages, 12th century Spain. Ibn Ezra repeatedly denied the existence of Shadim, evil spirits. He was a rationalist as well, and unfortunately for him, he traveled a lot through Europe. He traveled from Spain, he traveled to France, he traveled to Norman England, and he actually, while visiting in England in the Norman period, in the 12th century, while visiting in Norman England, he was on horseback, traveling through Sherwood Forest, and the Shadim, the evil spirits, were outraged that he had denied their existence. They ganged up on him and killed him in England, and that's where he died, at the hands of the Shadim, the very existence of which he had denied. You might wonder how I know all this. The way I know all this is because I read it in a book called Ktav Tamim, a 13th century rabbinic work written by Rav Moshe Taku, the rabbi of Wiener Neustadt, who wrote a book about the importance of believing literally everything in the Gemara. And in the course of his book, teaching us how important it is to believe everything literally, the way it says in the Gemara, he mentions the failure of the Ibn Ezra, who did not accept the existence of Shadim, and tells the story of his death in England. Why? You might wonder, why did the Ibn Ezra deny the existence of the Shadim? Well, The world out there, the big wide world out there, divides into two kinds of people. Everyone falls on one side or the other of the big divide. Some people are rationalist, and other people are mystical. And, you owe it to yourself to have some introspection, to try to think about which side of the divide you are on. Statistically speaking, most people are on the mystical side of the divide. The rationalist side has always been the minority, but Rambam, Ibn Ezra were rationalists, holding that human reason is imperative, the product of human reason must be accepted, leading them to a denial of Shadim. So, bottom line, what we know up to this point is that those rabbis, the majority of rabbis, accepting the existence of Shadim, might be following the opinion of Rashi. According to Rashi, the prohibition of seeking the dead really has nothing to do with the deceased themselves. Rather, it's a prohibition to seek out the evil spirits who reside in the cemetery with the dead, and it's those evil spirits with which we must have no commerce. Let's take a look at a different view. Now we have the view of the Rambam. It's clear, is it not, that Rambam's view cannot have anything to do with the evil spirits of the cemetery, because he held that there's no such thing as an evil spirit of the cemetery. So his understanding of the verse in the Torah and his understanding of the prohibition as presented to us by the Gemara is going to have to be different. Let's see the words of the Rambam. Kidei sheyavo meit b'chalom. The problem with someone who fasts and goes through a ritual preparation for sleeping overnight in the cemetery, the problem with all of this is he's doing it so that the deceased will come to him in a dream. He wants to have a dream. And he wants to have a very specific dream. He wants to have a dream where the deceased will come to him. Well, he's been hoping that the deceased would come to him in a dream, hoping. It didn't happen. In order to force the deceased to appear to him in a dream, he's going to go through the ritual preparation, fasting, and he's going to sleep in the cemetery. And then the deceased will come to him in a dream, Yodi'o, and the deceased will inform him in the dream, Masha Yish'al alav, whatever he will ask. Oh, according to the Rambam, we have here someone who needs information from the deceased. Dad, where did you leave the treasure? We can't find the treasure you buried. We need some information from the deceased. And he's been hoping that the deceased would come in a dream and tell him, it's buried on the left side of the barn, but it didn't come. He goes through the ritual preparation. He sleeps in the cemetery, hoping that the deceased will come to him in a dream and will answer him. See, in the Rambam, it's a kind of dialogue, a question of the deceased and an answer from the deceased. That's what's prohibited. Yesh achirim, others understand the prohibition differently. Shem loshim malbushim yuduim. Some people say, fasting isn't required. That's not a necessary ritual here to contact the dead. Instead, you have to wear certain specific garments. There's some kinds of garments which will do it. Omrim devarim, there's certain incantations to be recited. Maktirim ktaret, certain kind of incense has to be burned. Yidua, a certain specific kind of incense. Yishenim levadan, they sleep by themselves in private, not in the cemetery, but they sleep by themselves in private with these special pajamas, with this special incantations, with special incense. Kidei sheyavo meit plone yisaperi mo b'chalom, so that the deceased will come to him in a dream and inform him of what he wants to learn. Now, the Rambam presents several ways of understanding the prohibition. The common element of all of the ways is whether you fast or have incense. You have some kind of ritual preparation. It doesn't matter what it is, some kind of ritual preparation. And then you go to sleep, either in the cemetery or alone at home. It doesn't particularly matter where, but you go to sleep, all for the purpose of having the deceased come to you in a dream and answer your questions. Rambam says, Klalo shel davar. The basic underlying rule here, it's not specifically this scenario which is prohibited, and it's not specifically that scenario which is prohibited. The idea which is prohibited is kol ha'oseh, anyone who does anything, kedei sheyavo hamet, so the deceased will come to you, v'yodio, and inform you of what you want to learn, loket, you are in Torah violation of the prohibition, and you get the Torah punishment for that. According to Rambam, the meaning of the verse is simple and straightforward. The verse says, you dare not be doresh el hametim. You dare not seek out the dead, and that's exactly what is prohibited, going through any ritual procedure which will put you in contact with the deceased for the purpose of learning something from them. That that's the prohibition. Just in passing, it is, as you noticed, it's of course the prohibition. The penalty here is makot. The difference between makot and malkot is that makot is the Torah prohibition for violating Torah prohibitions. Malkot, with an L in it, is the rabbinic penalty for violating rabbinic prohibitions. So we have here a Torah violation. According to Rashi on the previous screen, the prohibition has to do with going to the cemetery, seeking out the evil spirit there, so that you get help in your magic. According to Rambam, the prohibition is going through any procedure in order to induce the deceased to appear to you and impart to you any information at all. Of course, no one has prohibited prayer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to God. That's okay. You can, of course, ask God to enlighten you and to bring you knowledge and wisdom. And indeed, that's what we do 3 times a day in the Shemona Esrei, where among the other bakashot, among the other things we ask of God, is to bring us wisdom and enlightenment. That's surely okay. So, according to Rashi, the prohibition is one which nowadays has very little practical application. There are not many people out there who are doing what Rashi describes as prohibited. On the other hand, what Rambam describes as prohibited now into something which has much broader application, and there really are people out there today who are doing things like this, which are prohibited according to the Rambam. Let's go one step further. The Re'em, Rav Eliezer Mehmet, from the High Middle Ages, today, Metz is in France. In those days, too, it was French-speaking. It is one of these places which goes back and forth between Germany and France after more or less every war. I always admired the energy of those Europeans who are able to move their cities from one country to another, just back and forth across the border, and just the energy involved in just picking up a whole city and moving it from France to Germany, back to France, back to Germany, back and forth. And then some of these cities, like Strasbourg, have moved back and forth 6 or 7 times. It's unbelievable. Rav Eliezer, he was from the Balei Tosafot, one of the great Tosafot figures, High Middle Ages, France. He says as follows: Hamashbia et hacholeh, someone who imposes an oath upon the sick person. I have a friend who is sick, a neighbor who is sick, a relative who is sick, and I go to visit the sick person, and boy, oh boy, they're really sick. I think they're going to die. So I say, hey, before you die, take an oath, make an oath, a shvuah, make an oath of the Torah, a shvuah, lashuv elav, to come back to me after you are dead, lachar misa, after you die, lahagid li asher yishal, make an oath now, while you're still alive, that after you die, you're going to come back to me and answer my questions about the next world or about whatever it is I want to know about. Oh, now, of course, if someone will make such an oath, then you'll have very strong impetus, then you'll be very strongly impelled after death to fulfill your promise, to fulfill your oath, and you'll come back to the person and reveal the knowledge which that person wants from you. Well, the Re'em, Rav Eliezer Memet says, Ein ze doresh al hametim. This is not a violation of seeking out the dead, even though you are asking a question and expecting to get back an answer from the dead. This is not a violation of the prohibition of the Torah, kevan she'eno doresh legufo shel met, because you are not speaking to a dead person. He is still alive when you are telling him or her to come back to you. You're asking a live person, come back later when you're dead. But the person you're speaking to is not yet dead, and therefore you're not guilty of seeking out the dead. Ela l'ruach. You're seeking out, what you want is, of course, not the physical person to return to you after death. What you want is his ruach, his spirit, to return to you after death. Ruach, nikramet, and the ruach, the spirit of a person, never dies. Now this is a very important idea. Humans are a mixture of two elements. We have our physical body and our spiritual element, which in life are bound together. From the spiritual point of view, death is neither more nor less than a separation of the physical elements of the body from the spiritual elements. The spirit continues to live, the body dies, the separating of ruach, spirit, and guf, body, the separation of spirit and body, that's what death is from the spiritual point of view. And here, you are not expecting the guf, the body of the deceased, to return to you. You're only expecting the ruach, the spirit, to return to you, and spirit never dies. When the Torah prohibits seeking the dead, the deceased, the Torah must be talking about the dead bodies. But if you're only concerned about the ruach, the spirit of the deceased, that never dies, and therefore the Torah never objected to seeking out the eternally living spirit of the dead. He brings a proof that he's right. We find examples of this in the Gemara. And if there are examples of this in the Gemara, it must be kosher, it must be correct. A Chassid Echad, one very pious rabbi in the days of the Gemara, Lan Beveit HaKvarot, would sleep in the cemetery, Lishmoa Ruchot Misaprot Zo Im Zo, in order to hear the spirits of the dead speaking with each other. Well, if the great pious rabbi in the days of the Gemara went to sleep in the cemetery in order to hear the spirits of the deceased conversing with each other, and he would listen in, eavesdrop, and learn important stuff, well, it must be permitted to be engaged with the spirit of the dead. It must be that the Torah was prohibiting engagement with the bodies of the dead. The body dies, but not the spirit. Amrunami Babahahu Pirka, Dishmuel, in the same chapter in the Gemara, it talks about Shmuel. Azal lechatzer mavit lishol me'aviv al ma'ot shel yitomim. There's a story in the same chapter of the Gemara about Shmuel the prophet who went to the cemetery to make inquiries of the deceased father to find out where he left the family fortune for the family to be able to find. Similarly, another passage in the Gemara, Litchazei li mar, where one of the great rabbis said to the other, after you die, I hope you will appear to me after your death. Well, the Re'im, Rav Eliezer Memetz, the rabbi whose writings we have on the screen before us, clearly holds that there's no problem whatsoever in being engaged with the spirit, the ruach of the deceased, because the ruach, the spirit of the deceased, never dies, and the Torah only prohibits our engagement with the dead. That means the bodies of the dead. No, he did not go to his own father. He went on behalf of someone else. The Re'em has this position, brings all these proofs from the Gemara, one story after another from the Gemara of great rabbis who listened to the spirit of the deceased. Sufficient proof from his point of view that engagement with the spirit of the dead is entirely correct. So far we have three approaches of the great Rishonim, the great medieval authorities. Rashi's approach, prohibiting engagement with the evil spirit in the cemetery. Rambam's approach, prohibiting anything which will cause the deceased to come in a dream or to impart any information to you at all. Position number three, that of the Re'em on the screen at the moment, prohibiting any engagement with the body of the deceased, as long as one is consulting only the spirit of the deceased. All is well, according to this opinion. Now, given these diverse approaches among the Rishonim, we of course are going to want to have some clear idea of which of these approaches is the approach embraced by the great Acharonim, by the great contemporary, by the great modern poskim. Well, the Shach, whose commentary is printed on the outside margin of every standard edition of the Shulchan Aruch. He was Eastern Europe. He was of Polish origin, the 17th century. Probably the most influential of the Ashkenaz poskim who wrote commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. Well, if not the most influential, surely on anyone's short list of the most influential. He, in this particular point, reflects the mystical approach to Judaism, as I mentioned before, in the great divide between rationalists as opposed to mystics. Statistically speaking, the mystics are definitely in the majority, and therefore it's not surprising that the Shach falls on the majority mystical side of things, and he agrees entirely with the Re'em that we just saw on the previous screen. Hachiluk ben ruach leguf eno migumgam. The distinction between spirit and body is not a faulty distinction. It's a correct distinction. Al pi hachmei Kabbalah, according to the great Mikubalim, the great mystics in the Jewish tradition, and the Zohar, surely the greatest work of Jewish mysticism from the mystical point of view, from the point of view of Jewish mystical writings. Of course, we must embrace the distinction between body and spirit, and therefore, of course, we must embrace the halachic conclusions of the Re'em, Eliezer Mimetz, namely, as long as you are engaging the spirit of the deceased, all is well. monologue, correct, dialogue, correct, whatever it is, no problem at all. The problem would be engaging the deceased body. The body dies, not the spirit. For those of you who are interested in the Rambam's rationalism and why he denies the existence of Shadim, I direct you to his guide to the perplexed, in which he deals with this issue at length. And I just point out in passing that many great rabbis, led by the Gaon Vilna, had very angry words against the Rambam for having denied the existence of Shadim. So, in any event, yeah, we'll come to the body coming back without your asking for it. We'll come to this also. Rationalists, of course, believe that human reason produces wisdom and knowledge. The mystics, the underlying idea of mysticism is that experience produces knowledge and wisdom. Normally, there's no conflict at all between reason and experience, and we don't have to make a decision one way or another which we are putting our trust in. But sometimes the reason contradicts experience, and then we're going to have to decide which we are going to prefer as a source of knowledge. The rationalists opt for reason, the mystics opt for experience. This lies at the very foundation of the difference between the two. As a footnote, if you can handle a brief footnote for a moment, mysticism is rooted more in belief. Rationalism is rooted more in an acceptance of the power of the human mind. And in my footnote, I just point out in passing that the single greatest problem in the history of rationalist thought, from the Rambam on down, the single greatest problem in the history of rationalism is the simple fact that rationalists believe in the power of human reason, and that's a belief which rationalists have without a shred of evidence to support it. Rationalism, too, rests on belief, faith, namely belief or faith in the power of human reason. So that's enough for the footnote. Let's get back to the subject at hand. According to the Shach, the mystical approach is embraced. Seeking out the spirit of the deceased is fine. That never dies. We're not allowed to seek out the body of the deceased, a problem which rarely occurs nowadays. This is not only the opinion of the Shach, this is similarly the opinion of the Yoredeya, the Shulchan Aruch itself. The Ramah, the great Ashkenaz commentator on the Shulchan Aruch, adds the following words: Yesh matirim, there are those who permit. He's talking about engagement with the dead, right? Monologue or dialogue with the dead. There are those who permit this, afilu la'achar moto, even after death. Im eno mashbia gufo shel met rak rucho, if you do not engage the body of the dead, only the spirit of the dead. So, of the great approaches of the Rishonim, it's the mystical approach which is embraced by the mainstream Acharonim. Let's go one step further, bringing this down into contemporary times. The Dot Cohen, the text we are about to look at, was written by Rav Kook. Rav Kook was the first Ashkenaz chief rabbi of Israel, one of the big names in religious Zionism, one of the big names in modern Jewish thought. He happened to be a profoundly mystical person. His mystical writings are also terribly important, but he was a rabbi of immense stature, He was a rabbinic scholar of formidable dimensions. Let's see what he has to say about this whole issue. He's talking about the opinion of the Re'em, the third opinion of the great medieval authorities, the one which says that engaging the spirit is okay, not the body. Dafka, Drisha shel ma'ariv atzmo v'lam b'veit ha'kvaros kedei shetishra alav ruach tumah chavi aser. Surely the Re'em agrees with Rashi that we can have no business with the evil spirit of the cemetery. Mikol makom shar drishot l'meitim, but as long as you stay away from the evil spirit of the cemetery, and as long as you avoid the body of the deceased, any other seeking out of the deceased, ein bahem mishum issa, there's no problem at all, because any other seeking out of the deceased besides the body and the evil spirit which resides there, well, you have no problem at all. However, according to the Rambam, there is a problem. The Rambam wrote, and we saw the words of the Rambam, Klalo shel davar kol ha'oseh kedei sheyavo amet v'yodeh loka. According to the Rambam, anyone who does anything to receive any information from the deceased is guilty. Harei ein chiluk ben drisha ledrisha, ela echad hadaresh leguf, echad hadaresh leruach. According to the Rambam, any information, any attempt to get information from the deceased is prohibited. We therefore have this big controversy amongst the Rishonim. Rav Kook has brought both opinions and not issued a decision one way or another. According to Rav Kook, therefore, even though the majority of great rabbis are going in the mystical path, following the approach of the Re'em, thereby permitting any engagement with the Ruach, the spirit of the deceased, we have to also be nervous, we have to also be worried, we have to also be concerned about the opinion of the Rambam. It behooves us to be in accord not only with the thinking of Rashi, not only with the thinking of the Re'em, but it behooves us as well to be in accord with the thinking of the Rambam in practice. According to Rav Kook, we dare not ignore any of the opinions of the great Rishonim. In point of fact, our behavior, our activities must be in accord, must be kosher according to all the major opinions, and therefore we are not allowed to seek out the spirit of the cemetery, the evil spirit of the cemetery. We are not allowed to seek out the bodies of the deceased, and we are also not allowed to do anything which will lead to communication with the deceased. Rambam's opinion. We have to follow all of these according to Rav Kook. The Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch. Let me just point out in passing that he too was a great mystic. Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was a neighbor of the Arizal, the great mystic of early 16th century Tzfat in the Upper Galilee. He was not only a neighbor and good friend of the Arizal, the greatest of the Jewish mystics, but he too, Rav Yosef Karo himself, experienced mystical revelations, and he even wrote a book. You can buy a copy of it, Magid Meisharim, a book containing all of the wisdom which he learned in the course of his mystical revelations. From the mystical point of view, an absolutely fascinating book. So here, Rav Yosef Karo, whose text we are about to look at, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, was also a great mystic. Did he hold that communicating with the Maggid is okay? Sure, and he did it, and he wrote down all the communications from the Maggid, from the mystical spirit, and you can buy copies of the book. Yeah, according to Rav Kook, Ouija boards are therefore prohibited. That's a correct conclusion. They recently published the family of Rav Herzog. Rav Herzog was the successor of Rav Kook, and Rav Herzog too was a formidable rabbinic scholar, terribly influential, very profound scholar, and his tshuva, the family just recently published his rabbinic responsa, and for better or worse, there's a tshuva in his responsa recently published on the question of Ouija boards, and he decided to attend a seance with a Ouija board to see for himself exactly what was going on in order to have an opinion one way or another about whether it's permitted or prohibited. And for better or worse, the family apparently allowed various people to look at those tshuvas over the years before they were published, and the answer to this particular question was lifted and is no longer available in the published tshuvas of Rav Herzog. Only the question is there, and the answer is lost. Someone apparently made off with it while studying the material. Let's see what Reb Yosef Karo has to say on the issue. He is dead set against the mystical opinion of the Re'im. Reb Yosef Karo himself, a great mystic, rejects the mystical opinion of the Re'im. After all, the mystical opinion of the Re'im leads to vast leniencies. As long as you're only concerned with the spiritual domain, you're fine. This is rejected by Rav Yosef Karo, Shaharei Oto Chasid, because the proof brought from the stories in the Gemara about the pious rabbis who went to the cemetery to sleep there, to eavesdrop on the conversations of the spirits, those stories, lo halach lebeit hakvarot lidrosh mehametim. If you read those stories in the Gemara more carefully, you will realize that those pious rabbis did not go to the cemetery in order to hear the spirits of the deceased. Lo magufam, v'lo meruham. Those rabbis did not have any interest at all in learning anything, not from the bodies of the deceased, not from the spirits of the deceased. Acquiring information from the deceased had nothing to do with why those rabbis went to the cemetery. Kidiktani, as the Gemara says explicitly, Hiknitato ishto, v'halach v'lan b'veis hakvaros. The reason the rabbi went to sleep in the cemetery is because he had a fight with his wife, and his wife kicked him out of the house. And after he had the fight with his wife, and his wife kicked him out of the house, he went to sleep in the cemetery, and he just happened to hear Shamash te ruchot misaprot zomizo. He just happens to hear the spirits of the deceased conversing with each other. Mashma, implying, behedya, clearly implying, shelo halach lalun sham ela levroach v'kidatas ishto, clearly implying that he didn't go to the cemetery to hear the spirits. He went to the cemetery to escape his wife. That's the only reason he went. Uva mikra, and it just happened to occur that he heard those spirits talking. Similarly, the other stories which the Re'im brings in support of his contention that you have to distinguish between body and spirit collapse, and therefore, since the proofs are undermined, the conclusion therefore falls, and Rav Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, therefore rejects the great leniencies of the mystical approach based in the Re'im. Why did he go to a cemetery and not a friend's house? I have no idea. But if you want my guess, and the following is only my guess, I suppose it was a pleasant place. I suppose it had nice grass. I suppose it was like a garden. I suppose it was a pleasant place to sleep at night. And after having had a fight with his wife, after her driving him out of the house, kicking him out of the house, he probably wanted quiet. That's the word. He wanted quiet. He did not want to be engaged in conversation with his friends. He just wanted to be left alone, and that's a place where he knew he'd be left alone. I guess. I don't know. Well, we understand that according to Rabbi Yosef Karo, Ein Chiluk ben Daresh Laguf L'Daresh Rucho, the mystical distinction leading to all the leniencies is rejected by the Shulchan Aruch. The Daresh Laguf Hamet Mamish below Ruach Ato Guf L'Chude Mide Mamash Ispe. The Torah, after all, prohibits seeking out the dead, and the idea of seeking out the body, the decaying or decayed body of the dead, it doesn't make any sense at all. I mean, who would do that? The Torah surely is talking about a prohibition of seeking out the spirit of the dead. The only reason that we can permit the living to take an oath before they die to return after death is because the person is still alive, and therefore we're asking a living person to come back later. And indeed, a living person, not yet dead, of course you can ask him or her to come back later after death and answer your questions, because the person's not dead yet, and therefore no prohibition. But once the person has died, then we must follow Rambam's opinion and block any attempt at communication with the deceased. That's the opinion of Shulchan Aruch. Now here we see a divergence of thought. The Shulchan Aruch, and it's hard to point to a more influential work in the history of Jewish law, the Shulchan Aruch is rejecting the mystical approach, even though he personally was a mystic himself, is rejecting the mystical approach, thereby rejecting the leniencies which flow from the mystical approach, thereby prohibiting any attempt at dialogue with the deceased. The Shach, on the other hand, the great commentary from 17th century Poland that we saw 2 screens ago, he, also mystical, is embracing the mystical approach. It follows, therefore, that this controversy between the mystical and rational approach of the Middle Ages continues into modern poskim. The modern poskim have exactly the same problem. At this point, what we are going to do is pause. Next time, we're going to speak about the visiting of grave sites of relatives, friends, visiting grave sites of great tzaddikim, great rabbis. We're going to talk about the visiting of grave sites, what should and what should not be done in visiting, and we will see the approaches of the great poskim in that matter. Until then, I wish you a good week. Look forward to seeing you all again next Sunday. Until then, shalom, shalom.